Sonali has prepared a very interesting talk for us related to climate adaptation. She will present elements of her ongoing research on the subject, and her presentation will be followed by a Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariana. And thank you all for submitting. Well, thank you to Apex Art for having me and providing this online platform for me to give this talk still. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. I might minimize your lovely faces just so I can see my actual slides. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides right now at the moment. And if you're looking at them, one of the things that you'll be seeing is movement, right? What you're looking at here is the temperature, the surface air temperature changes since about the 1880s, starting around 1870. And you're looking at the average temperature for each month of the year. And so one of the things that we see, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, is a seasonal cycle, right? So in the Northern Hemisphere, we have cooler winters relatively, and then these warmer summers. And what you're looking at in the motion are the temperatures, or rather the temperature changes over time since the 1800s, which we take as the start of the Industrial Revolution, right? When we first started burning these fossil fuels, up until 2016, relatively recently. And on the right-hand side, what you're seeing are the record years. When we start to include 2019, which has been a record year, and 2020, which is looking so far like it will also be a record year, what we find is that the top 5 record years have occurred in the last decade, right? And so climate has very much changed already, right? So we're talking about adaptation in a climate change. And we're seeing this, right? So that's something that we have to plan for. And we're seeing this in the seasonal cycle as well too, right? So our summers and winters, right? The distribution of these temperature changes can shift throughout the year and throughout space. Now, one of the things that you're not seeing here, right? I think we worry a lot about global temperature increases, which is what's being crafted here in each of these lines. But that doesn't tell us a lot about what's happening at the regional scale, the regional scale at which we really have to start thinking about adaptation and even in some respects mitigation. And so what I want to do in this talk is sort of set the context for thinking and talking about adaptation. What do we mean when we say adaptation? Adaptation for whom? What are the strategies that we're approaching? How are we strategically thinking about adaptation? What are the strategies that we're approaching adaptation with? There are some major considerations that I want to raise just for us to think about, and I can't hope to resolve a lot of the uncertainties in this talk itself. There are many really smart people working on this in different capacities and at different levels, but we want to think through some considerations here. And then I'll talk about a few modes of adaptation, how communities are adapting around the globe and how they're approaching this. And then we'll kind of move to some future directions and framing, and we'll get to this image a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so one of the things that I think we're probably more viscerally familiar with is when we're talking about climate change are the changes in extremes, right? And when we start to think about adaptation, right, one of the things that we're adapting to and anticipating are changes in extreme events over time. So storm surges and extreme storms, drought, extreme heat events. And we're interested in how these impact both humans and natural ecosystems, right? And so a lot of our adaptation framing is with respect to extremes. And we know that extremes, as we can see here, are kind of shifting over time as the background climate is changing. So what you just saw here was a movement of our background climate in a way that makes extreme heat, right, hot days and extreme heat much more likely, right? And we know that as a certainty with climate change, that these extremes will become more likely over time. And it's something that we're already experiencing. it feels like forever ago, in the context of all of these, turbulent current events that are happening right now. But just near the beginning of this year, right, end of 2019 into 2020, if you'll remember, Australia experienced some of the most intense wildfires that they've had in recorded history. And so what you're looking at right here are the temperature changes, or rather the actual temperatures around the early January across Australia, right, the middle of their summer. Some of these colors that you're seeing here, those light purples, actually had to be added to the color bar because they didn't have a color bar that could accommodate the maximum temperatures that they were seeing. This is the equivalent of about 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And, we all got used to, at that time of year, seeing sort of the violence of these pictures, right? These intense reds and the intensity of impact, right, to both human and natural ecosystems. And so as extremes intensify in a climate change, we can expect more events like this. Now, in proper scientific speak, I will say that there were many things contributing to these fires this past year, including some changes in the Indian Ocean sea surface temperatures. But we know that climate change was likely an exacerbating factor here. So we know this, and we're planning for this. And to that extent, we're certain that climate change is here and that we have to deal with it. But then the question really becomes, well, what are the best ways to deal with it, and how do we deal with it, and how much information do we need in order to deal with climate change? What you're looking at here are some characterizations of uncertainty, and so I want to point out a few things in this image. The first is that you're looking on the left-hand side at a best case scenario by the end of the century. So this is a scenario in which we are aggressively pursuing mitigation options. Important to note that even in this scenario, we experience warming. We've already warmed, right? So even under best case conditions, we can anticipate warming a little bit more. And then on the right-hand side is kind of more of our worst case, a very fossil fuel driven development trajectory. And we can see that the warming is amplified. But here's a few other subtleties. What you're looking at here, this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a broad climate change assessment, including all of the world's climate scientists and models. What you're looking at here is the number of models that were used to create this figure, okay? So 32 and 39. That's like having 32 or 39 independent evaluations from 32 or 39 different doctors, right, about the state of health. The dots that you see, the stippling on the map, indicates where the models agree, roughly. Okay, and so we have a lot of agreement about surface temperature. We're quite, while there's still some uncertainty, right, we're quite certain that the temperature is going up, and these are perhaps some minimum amounts by which they'll go up. But what I wanted to point out here is this little area that we see up here, the hatch marks, okay? These hatch marks are areas actually where there's not a very clear signal from the noise. Either the models don't agree, or we don't actually have much confidence of what the trends are within these particular regions. Now, we don't see a lot of this for surface temperature, and so we have more confidence here. But look at what happens when we go to rainfall, right? What you're looking at here are the same plots, but now with precipitation. And so one of the things that you'll note is that we actually have a lot more hatching than we do the dots, the stippling, right? And so one thing to draw from this is that we have a lot more uncertainty in the mean or average rainfall changes that we'll expect moving into the future. In fact, what we often say is that we expect wet areas to get wetter and dry areas to get drier. But when you think about this from an adaptation standpoint, that's not exactly all that helpful, right? By how much will our average rainfall change? When we start to get down to the regional level, and even when you start to get down even finer grain to the most vulnerable populations, for example, on island states, right, or in urban centers, we have even less information about that scale, right, of influence. So one of the things that this brings up for us is we must begin to think about adaptation and decision-making in the face of uncertainty, right? We're never going to be 100% certain about these things, and we are far from it for several important climate variables. So how do we go about thinking about making decisions and adapting? And so here's a common figure that's used to talk about and separate, right? Because when we think about adaptation, and Mariana has said this quite nicely above, right? That kind of sits within this compendium of climate change actions, right? That fall loosely under either adaptation, which we'll talk about today, or mitigation, which is effectively curbing our greenhouse gases, something that we very much need to do. But I bring this up here for two reasons. One, we want to think about the differences between these two specifically and how that manifests from a policy perspective. And secondly, there's this overlapping area, right, that can somewhat address both, right? And these tend to be very technological solutions, so green infrastructure, power system resilience, building weatherization. But we're increasingly thinking about the convergence of these two areas. How do we kind of feed two birds with one stone? I really like that phrasing. As we start to think about ways to tackle the climate crisis. But for now, I want to focus on the actions that we take in this particular circle, right? The actual adaptation circle. And I want to kind of put forth a kind of pseudo framework for this and bring up some important considerations. So the few comments that you're going to see on the next few slides are derived from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? So these big assessment reports that the United Nations puts out every few years. We're actually working right now on the 6th assessment report. These are from the assessment report that came out in 2013, 2014, the 5th assessment report. And this report, you know, it's publicly available. I definitely encourage you, if you haven't engaged with it, to actually look at the figures and download these reports. They're actually a very underutilized resource when it comes to basic public education and outreach. And we actually use this in my classes. But they have a whole chapter that focuses on adaptation. And some key points to bring up here is that the framing of adaptation has now moved in an important way. Historically, it used to focus on biophysical vulnerability, right? So the vulnerability of ecosystems, the physical human systems, and how they respond to temperature or water, or what their susceptibility is to storms or other sorts of biophysical drivers. But we've started to shift and move beyond this to think about the wider social and economic drivers of vulnerability and even precarity that can influence people's ability to respond, right? When we talk about adapting to climate change, we have to understand, right, that there is this underlying set of issues that can either help or hinder a community's ability to really engage. And I think this is where it gets into the social and environmental justice issues that Mariana is interested in tackling. These drivers can include gender, age, health, status, ethnicity, and groups, and the strength of institutions, which we'll talk about in just a second. Historically, and as you can see in that area that overlapped between mitigation and adaptation, technological adaptation options have often received the most funding and the most emphasis. But now we actually see growing experience and growing interest in the value of what we're calling community-based adaptation and ecosystem-based adaptation, which are things that we'll talk about in a little bit. And also the need to buffer institutional measures and provide social supports in order to achieve our adaptation goals. So moving really beyond technology, right, which is helpful but not a panacea, into thinking about this more broadly. Now, in this third point, right, when we see that climate has changed and when we see that we are increasing our propensity for extremes and that those will bring more impacts, one of the things that we reckon with is that adaptation now has to stretch beyond just making incremental changes. And we really need to start thinking about transformative changes that now may be necessary in order to prepare or deal really with current climate impacts. And the longer we wait, the more we push this envelope of how severe our adaptation options might have to be. And we'll talk about the ramifications of that in just a bit. But when we start to look at the latest adaptation literature, there are two critical pillars that are now seen to be really pivotal to the success of adaptations, and that is adaptations that bring in and incorporate local governments and kind of the local scale private sector. So in other words, big institutions and national governments have a very important role to play, which we'll talk about in just a second. But we know that because adaptation is inherently local, we really need to build these connections from the bottom up in a way that we really just haven't done just yet. And so this brings up some interesting and important questions that we need to ask ourselves about adaptation, right? So climate change must now factor somehow into institutional deliberations and decision-making more than ever before. It is not enough to think about your community and plan for the next 10 years or 15 years, infrastructural operations or anything about your community without taking climate change into consideration. But this begets some important questions, right? So is adaptation all about minimizing damage? Is that the way that we think about and frame adaptation, or are there opportunities here as well? And I think with this group, and one of the biggest contributions of the arts, right, is to really envision and provide that vision for those opportunities, right, as opposed to just minimizing damages, which you can kind of get into the framing of doing if you're just working on the technical side of things. How much must be known about future climate changes in order to make decisions about adaptation? When you make a decision, right, about your livelihood, about adapting in your personal life to challenges, how much information do you typically need? And how does that dictate the adaptation strategy that you choose? I've already showed you that while some things are more certain under a changed climate, right? So for example, moving towards more frequent and stronger extremes, there are some things that we just don't have a very good handle on yet, right? Like fine grained, fine scale projections of rainfall, for example. So how much does this decision maker need in order to develop an adaptation solution? Do we and how do we distinguish between adaptations in human and natural systems? So much of what we do are really coupled natural human systems, right? So how do we start to think about adaptations that might be good for human systems versus natural systems and where the synergies are, right? Here is a really interesting bullet point, right? The second to last one. Can and should adaptation to climate change be distinguished from normal development and planning processes? And there are reasons to think that they might, although the reality is that they probably can't and perhaps shouldn't. So I just put this question in your mind right now as we move throughout the rest of the talk. And then lastly, okay, we're talking about adapting to climate change and long-term planning, but do we actually have a current adaptation deficit? Are we well adapted even to our current climate situations? And the answer in many regions is probably not, right? So there's this adaptation deficit that exists already that we might need to address. And of course, it's critical to avoid maladaptation, which we'll define a little bit better in just a bit, but we can kind of think of this right now as incomplete or ill-conceived adaptation options that could actually bring greater suffering. And so there's a lot of terminology floating around out there when it comes to discussing adaptation. It's, I think, important and useful to kind of have a working definition of these things. And so you'll often hear the term resilience being put out there, right? And so when we think about, well, how much information do we need to adapt? Some of you might have gone to a place of, well, we should just be building resilient communities and societies no matter what the changes are. And that's an important way to think about adaptation. But if we actually define resilience for a second from an ecological standpoint, right, it's the capacity of a system to absorb a disturbance, right, using whatever means it has available, and then reorganize to basically maintain its current functionality. So think of a rubber band, right? If I stretch a rubber band and disturb it, you know, if I don't stretch it too much, right, it should come back and maintain its basic form and functionality. And so one example of this in the agricultural environment is kind of adjusting planting dates. So maybe we have longer growing seasons and hotter growing seasons, and farmers will typically adapt by just maybe advancing or rather planting, sowing their seed a little bit earlier, but maybe not changing the entire cropping system. That's using the resources and wherewithal they currently have. On the flip side of things, and something that we need to be confronting more, is adaptive capacity, right? And which differs, right? So when resilience is exceeded, right, when that rubber band snaps, we really need to think about transformative changes. And these changes are so interesting and so important because they can actually totally change the paradigm in which you're working, right? And so one example here is tapping the Ogallala Aquifer in the middle of the United States, right? The Great Plains, the High Plains region has been a region that has been susceptible to drought since its inception. The ecologies there are drought adapted, right? And for some of you, you may know in the 1930s, we had a big dust bowl across that area. And underlying these systems was this massive aquifer, which we tapped thereafter, right? Kind of the turn of the 20th century. And that really can fundamentally change that agro-ecosystem in so many ways. And so that's really transformational, but we have to be careful about what these changes, these transformations bring. So the challenge is that near future climate change is irreversible and uncertain, right? So resilience is a good thing, and we need to think about this and what is needed to build resilience. But then there's this subsequent question where adaptive capacity sits in, and that is it enough? Is it enough to be able to adapt in order to maintain the basic functionality of our systems? Or are we really looking to transform these systems into something entirely new, right? And then what would that take? And so I wanted to say a word about institutions and education on this front, because when we talk about adaptive capacity and building adaptive capacity for what will have to be transformational change in many areas, it's governments and institutions, right, local governments and institutions to some degree, that have the potential to directly reduce risks to vulnerable areas and populations and enhance adaptive capacity. And this is really by developing and implementing locally appropriate policies and approaches. So, for example, this can include zoning, stormwater management, building codes, attending to the needs of vulnerable populations and basic service provisioning. Local governments and institutions are going to be critical to advancing our transformational ability and our adaptive capacity. However, many governments, particularly local governments, lack resources to advance the adaptive capacity. This could be technology, it could be human resources and knowledge, it could be financing, right, particularly at these local levels. And so while adaptation is inherently locally focused, there's definitely a role, and I would actually go so far as to say an obligation for the international community and national governments to help provision and provide for enhancing localized adaptive capacity. So adaptation being a very localized process, right, does not absolve larger actors from working, working to that end. But there's difficulties with that, which we'll get to in just a second. Furthermore, and this is kind of where some of these international actors come into play, some essential foci of development can aid in climate adaptation, right? So scholars and what's kind of emerging in the literature, which I can share later, have noted that education and literacy is actually one of the key indicators of how people select adaptation options, how local communities select adaptation options, while the lack of education can be considered a constraint on adaptation that amplifies vulnerability. Now, this might seem pretty obvious, and indeed, literacy can build human resources, right, within a region that can advance this. But here's a little bit of a catch: education, institution building, and bolstering, right, and implementing learning support programs can take time, right? And there's a lot of other things that need to change to help advance that. Meanwhile, our climate continues to change rapidly. So what we're confronting here is that we know that some of the institution building that can actually lead to the most beneficial adaptation options, we haven't given it enough, we haven't really given a good cushion of time for those institutions to really develop and build and be supported in terms of the climate action, the action that we need to take to avert dangerous anthropogenic interference, right? These are long-term processes, but our climate is changing much more quickly than that. So then how do we think about stopgap solutions, or what are some other solutions that can be implemented, right? So there are different lines of adaptation, scales of adaptation that need to be implemented here. And so, as I mentioned, adaptation is highly localized and context specific. Sorry for the poor resolution here, but this is just an excerpt of a table in the latest IPCC report, as I mentioned, that focuses on adaptation. That looks at adaptive strategies across some key domains, and the list is much larger than this, but I just pulled a few out because I think it's interesting to see what sectors each of these places is focusing on, what their approach and strategies are. In some cases, it's not even clear what the vulnerabilities are, so there needs to be an entire assessment to define those vulnerabilities, such as in the Kimberley in Australia. The adaptive actions implemented can vary largely as well too. A lot of them, as you can see, document local observations, compile observed changes, increase monitoring. A lot of them require some basic infrastructure to just monitor and get a sense of what's changing before solutions are applied. This TEK that you're seeing here is traditional ecological knowledge. There is a rising sphere of study to really try to help systematically incorporate that, and you'll see that come up in several different locations. And as I said, this list goes on. And what's also interesting to me is to see who's involved, right? What are the main institutions that are involved? And in many cases, what you'll see are NGOs, national level organizations, and what we'd really like to see more in universities, right? And these kind of create this linear form of knowledge, right? From the experts and big agencies down to the community level. What I'd really like to see more of are those community-based solutions. And I want to just present an example from work that we've been doing on the AgMIT project that Mariana had mentioned upon introduction. And so I'm not going to go into all of the details of this project, but effectively what we did, we were funded by UKAID, and we were tasked with projecting the impacts of climate change on food security and developing adaptation options with local stakeholders in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And so we have our mission statement on this slide, and I can share these slides a bit later, and I think it's being recorded too, but here's a URL that shows some of our results, which are just being populated. But I wanted to provide an example. So firstly, I'll just start with our structure. There's a lot of circles and diagram and kind of arrows on this diagram, but what I wanted to highlight here was that this was an interdisciplinary project. And so we had climate scientists, crop scientists, and economists and social scientists that we were working with, and kind of to integrate information to kind of look at the impact of climate change across all of these dimensions and all of these dimensions, and then use this framework to develop adaptation options that feed back across these expertise fields. And what's the other important thing to mention about this project is that, you know, we had our core team, which I comprised, but all of the regional projects across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia were led by scholars from universities in those domains. And I was quite happy about that, so that it wasn't just a Western science kind of being handed off, but it was something that you know, built capacity, but also, you know, these researchers know their areas best, and it's important to incorporate that. And so I want to give one example from Zimbabwe, where we had focused in the Kai district on particular cropping systems in each one of these locations. And this particular region, we had maybe a couple hundred farmers that were surveyed. And, you know, we kind of had this caricature or narrative of farmers across, particularly smallholders, as being like there's some kind of one representative farmer or one kind of system. And I think what we rarely do, at least in the West, is acknowledge that farmers have a huge diversity in these regions. Within these regions, there are richer farmers and poorer farmers, and farmers that have changed their systems. So we want to capture that heterogeneity. And so these systems were integrated crop animal systems. Most farms had animals for draft power and used the manure crop production, and nearly all farmers cultivated corn, maize. A third produced groundnuts, and a third produced small grains. So that's kind of the context for this particular site we were working in. And so we kind of went through our analysis, and we said, okay, working with the, with our models and our computational frameworks with the scientists in region, we said, okay, first of all, how might the climate change? And what you're seeing here are the changes in temperature, and actually my little dots dropped off, but we're kind of looking in this space. Here, the temperature increases to somewhere between 2 or 3 degrees. And around here are the rainfall changes. But as I mentioned before, this is just one snapshot, but the models show a great deal of change. So any one particular model out of the 32 or 39 could show something a little bit different. So we actually took a range of models, which is what you're seeing here, models that ran a bit hotter and wetter, and models that ran a bit drier in order to bracket that uncertainty. And one of the things that we found is that losses were usually larger than the gains. But it turned out that groundnut and maybe sorghum actually had a little bit more resilience to them. So yes, the losses were large, but if the rainfall did tip into a place of being a little bit wetter, you could actually even potentially have some gains. So we said, okay, groundnuts and sorghum in this region are looking better than maize and could potentially be used to help buffer these systems. And importantly, this is what farmers are already growing. It's what they're already using. So our economic analysis suggested that adoption of adaptations that incorporated the groundnuts or drought-tolerant maize could be useful. So we said, okay, we worked with local stakeholders, and we said, local researchers, and we said, what kind of adaptation plan can we devise that can be implemented right now that could help buffer this system against climate change? And we came up with this 3-step process. And so in step 1, and so what you're looking at here are the net returns to the farm, right? So how much are they contributing to their own livelihood? Are they building their livelihood? And we were able to capture some of the differences between the farms. So these farmers tended to have more resources than ones with no animals. And so in step 1, we said, okay, let's actually promote and intensify the drought-tolerant crops, right? Let's actually introduce drought-tolerant seeds for maize. Let's promote the sorghum. And what that will at least help do is return more matter, organic matter, to the soils and start to enrich the soils and provide a bit more return for the farms, which is what you're seeing here. Once the soil starts improving, we know that the groundnuts, the legumes, actually did a little bit better. So let's actually start having more farmers weave in the groundnuts into their cropping system. And what we see is that when we do that, and when the soils are ready for that, the returns go up, at least particularly for the more the farms with more resources, even more. And then in step 3, we said, okay, if you're going to be growing more groundnut, you need an outlet for it. So maybe we can work with local planners to actually create markets that are local, where farmers can sell these groundnuts and create cooperatives and actually create the financial infrastructure to allow for enhanced groundnut sales. And so that was our step 3. And the point with this is that, we sometimes approach adaptation from this technological standpoint, where we need to create these really improved seeds and technologies and bring it into these regions and do these technology transfers. But I think that there is a huge role for adaptation with local resources, with stuff, right, with resources that farmers, in this case, or that local people already have, right? How do we use it and mobilize that a little bit better? And I think that's what this example really nicely illustrates, is that you can actually get pretty far in terms of building resilience and developing adaptation options with local resources. It might not get you all the way, but it's important to consider before we start importing in technologies. Okay, so that's one example, right, of how local adaptation can take place. we do know that there are constraints on adaptation. Now, there's not really a consistent framework to assess constraints everywhere, and these can really vary. But we do generally know that constraints on adaptation can be physical, they can be biological in terms of tolerance of individuals and populations, they can be economic and financial, human resource limited, even cultural to some extent. And I'm sure, in some ways, culture can both advance and in some cases inhibit adaptation. And as we talked about before, governments and institutional. And so these constraints are important. But I think one of the ways that we're thinking about getting around these constraints is by conceiving of and developing new modes of adaptation. And they're not really new, but they're just underappreciated and represented modes of adaptation that are now starting to become more prevalent. And so one of this includes community-based adaptation. And I have all these pictures here just to illustrate that it's happening here, it's happening in South Asia, it's happening in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's happening everywhere, right? And this is actually really just recognizing what's already there, right? People function within their close-knit communities in really highly organized ways, right? We rely on each other. We can leverage that, right, in order to make communities more resilient, or even in some cases introduce transformative changes. What this requires, however, in several cases, is the official recognition that community groups matter and that they're needed in order to affect the kinds of change we want to see. And the official recognition here specifically is money, right? We need money and resources being shunted to these communities and then allowing them to do with those funds what they see as best fit for those communities. Autonomy and agency, right, are what these communities need. And that's true no matter where you are across the planet. And we're seeing the mobilization and rise of these efforts, I think much more than we have historically. Another emerging mode of adaptation is ecosystem-based adaptation, right? So now instead of necessarily just building seawalls, which New York City is still contemplating, although that seems to go back and forth, or building hard infrastructure, we now instead craft ecological adaptation options that weave in the functionality of natural ecosystems and the services that they provide us, which are kind of outlined and detailed here. So, for example, in a coastal ecosystem, instead of building a seawall to prevent storm surges and sea level storm surges, maybe instead you would use reed beds or oyster beds or coastal vegetation to absorb shocks and provide water purification and a whole other set of services and benefits. This is really great, and I think more needs to be done on this side of things. One of the interesting points of tension with this, though, is that by looking to harness those ecosystem services that protect our infrastructure or that from which we derive benefits, there is a little bit of tension there between anthropogenically selecting those ecosystem services that we care most about, right, in lieu of others. So we are making, through ecosystem-based adaptation, a conscious effort to select those ecosystems that are at service to us to really put an anthropogenic stamp on the natural ecosystems that exist. There's a great Radiolab episode that actually talks about ecosystem services and valuing them and how that creates a bit of controversy, which I've linked here, so it's worth a listen to, but you can start to see where this tension might lie. But overall, it can be a really resourceful and beneficial thing, right? And so we look at agroforestry, not just in Ithaca, but also being implemented and widely practiced now across Africa. Community gardens, permaculture buildings, for example, even just the conversion of our terrible lawns around the United States into native ecosystems as well too, right? These can provide multiple services, including aesthetics and spirituality to our communities. It's just important to think about how we do it. And of course, there are limits adaptation as well. Let's see, in the interest of time, I'm actually not going to go through all of this because I want to start to get to a Q&A as well. But the question starts to, we start to face the question of, this is all well and good, but what happens if you're in a region or a climate or an ecosystem where at some point you're going to hit a limit to adapting, right? Where you face these intolerable risks. What will you do then, and whose obligation is it to take care of that? And I'll give an example of that in just a second. But first I wanted to highlight this. Now these figures are a little bit dated, but the math kind of still works out. So I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers here, but it's kind of the percentages that are important here. Most coordinated climate finance, really, and that's kind of, if I had to kind of identify sort of one thing to kind of put our, it's put our money where our mouth is, right? If these are the things that we want to further and, ecosystem-based, community-based adaptation at all, we need to start approaching it from a policy and financing perspective like we mean it. But most finance goes towards mitigation still, or projects that have that overlap between mitigation and adaptation. And a lot of those are technological, as we mentioned before. And you can kind of see the breakdown over time. And I guess, again, I said this is a bit dated, but hasn't changed all that much. And so the question becomes why, right? Why is this barrier to funding adaptation options? And so this is actually pulled a little bit from The Economist, and I actually thought they kind of explored this in an interesting way. Moving house, improving water supplies, adjusting sowing dates. These are things that people will do for themselves if given a chance. Or at least this is one of the reasons why adaptation has not been the subject of public debate in the same way that mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from industry and deforestation have, right? It will happen on its own. Historically, so I would say that this is not really true anymore, but historically, there's even been some reticence on behalf of environmental actors to see attention paid to adaptation. And I do think that historically, the statement has some weight in the sense that if we started to put money towards adaptation, we would start to lose the overall goal of mitigation. I don't think that's true anymore, and I don't think that's the way that most groups are approaching it. But we have that historical legacy, right, that we need to deal with and close that gap. And how big is that gap? Well, let's put it this way. The range of funds that are required that we think for adaptation is about the same order of magnitude as foreign aid that's given to countries right now, which is not trivial, but still pretty low compared to GDP of industrialized nations. And this was, as of 2014, there was a pretty huge gap between what's actually been committed and what we actually need to fund adaptation. And remember, this gap is dynamic. It's going to increase with time. And so before I get into, I'll spend maybe probably another 5 to 10 minutes moving through the last few slides here. I found this approach to discussing adaptation useful and interesting. And we'll start to circle back to this in just a bit. And so there are two discourses on adaptation that are presented to the literature. And I think that this particular study, which I can provide, summarizes them in a nice way. The first is this adaptation as development narrative. And I think there is an extent to which these cannot be separated. But this discourse frequently is frequently articulated by development agencies, such as UKAID, and emphasizes the similarities between development and adaptation, right? So for decision makers and researchers focused on sustainable development, adaptation describes a broad range of actions that tend to have a climate focus. That being said, there is this alternative, right, which looks at adaptation as equity. This becomes really important in the case of transformative change or catastrophic loss that we'll talk about in a second. This discourse is not from aid agencies, but actually in the context of emerging economies that say that, this is not about development, this is about compensation for damages. If I'm in a community that has to adapt, right, and communities that are most strongly impacted by climate change are those that have to adapt more. The communities that are most strongly impacted by climate change are those that have contributed least to the problem often. So this is about compensation, not about development per se. And so there's power to this argument, I think, that rears itself when we talk about a specific context, and that is mobility and migration, right? So discourses on adaptation become particularly relevant when considering this question of a person's right to move. And what we're seeing a lot of in the literature and the media is that climate change is going to be driving more migration. And I think, you know, we actually just started a big project funded by our National Science Foundation to look at migration out of West Africa. And what we're finding is that it is complicated and nuanced. And there are many more variables underlying the climate change conditions that need to be considered. And that those contexts can change greatly when you move from West Africa to parts of South Asia or even parts of Central America. And teasing out that climate signal is not always all that logical. And so there's sort of, if we kind of start at the high level, there are some obvious ways in which climate change can impact mobility, right, or movement. Climate change can be push factors, environmental degradation, degradation through war, right, or there can also be pull factors, economic opportunity and community support, right? And we're kind of weighing these against each other. And this is actually just one framing to discuss mobility and migration. There exist others. At a minimum, right, climate change is expected to compound regional instability through just impacting water supplies, impacting food supplies, or just through the wholesale loss of key ecosystem services, widespread environmental degradation. In fact, these destabilizers are often called in the security space threat multipliers. And there are some reasons why this framing is problematic. And so the climate connection can be more easily discernible in some types of migration than others. So let's say temporary migration after an extreme storm, hurricanes, for example, that have hit the Caribbean, or losses of land due to sea level rise. In that case, there are choices to be made between moving and converting your livelihood system as well. And so in some cases, you might be able to more easily discern that climate change signal than in others. This is an interesting map that the New York Times had compiled, actually, that looked at UN persons of concern overlaid by climate change indices. And so areas that have overlapping dark gray and overlapping red, you know, would likely be areas where you might tease out that climate change signal. But one thing to note here is that they don't always co-occur all that frequently on this map. And so, like I said, I'll share, this is being recorded and I'll leave it to you to kind of look at this into more detail. But what emerges from this picture is something that's much more nuanced. That being said, right, we talked about sort of that catastrophic loss. We, in 2016, actually just acknowledged some of the first climate refugees in this country, the Chimacha Choctaw tribe. That picture that you saw at the beginning was off the coast, the southern coast of the United States, the Gulf Coast, Isle de Jean Charles, off the coast of Louisiana. And the indigenous communities there had won a contest that was enabled through the Department of Housing and Urban Development called the National Disaster Resilience Competition, and given $48 million to actually relocate due to climate damages, basically the loss of this island ecosystem. And so the tribal chief there said, we don't have time, the longer we wait, the more hurricane season we have to go through, the more that we lose our island. But of course, the corollary with that is that there's a part of that identity, that culture that's lost too. And so how do you actually value that in terms of a payment is both interesting. But in this case, right, there's a much clearer climate change signal here, although this particular tribe, or actually amalgamation of tribes, has an underlying history of destabilization that should also be addressed. And it's hard to account for that in a one lump sum, right? But mobility and migration is, I want to focus on this, because I think it blends in nicely with some of the questions that Mariana has asked, but also when we talk about adaptation and the right to adapt and the right to undertake the livelihood preservation that you see fit, there's so much to that statement, and the way that it's framed, the way that it's visualized, even in the arts, really matters, right? The decision to stay put and switch livelihood activities has always been considered a form of adaptation. When you look at the West African Sahel, those communities have been adapted to mobilizing anytime confronted with the drought over the millennia of their evolution in some ways. And so how do you call migration now adaptive versus what has historically happened? And so our project focuses on West Africa. And what's interesting is sort of the discourse that you see in the media, that it's all kind of climate change focused. And then when you actually start to look at the academic literature within the space, you see things like climate change is not the cause and migration is not the problem. That we're framing this, that the media is framing this in a very different way, in a very different light. And so there's the new work that we're kind of trying to synchronize with here to help kind of disaggregate and challenge some of these narratives. The UN Climate Network, the folks who put out that IPCC, really emphasized the securitization of migration. And this particular paper that came out very recently said, instead of being challenged, the emphasis on securitization is not only just bad from a framing perspective, but what it does is it actually winds up shunting funds, resources for climate adaptation when they should be going towards institution building, educational options, actually making communities more resilient, right? And so the framing of the problem as being climate change or not can actually dictate where the resources go. And so this particular editorial in Nature Climate Change suggests that new research supported by scientific funding programs should examine and address climate mobilities as a new normal, not as something bad, not as something to stop, but as something that people have a right to do and should be looked at in that way, right? And not necessarily call it migration, but just frame it as a larger, broader framing of mobility overall. And so what interests me is, how does that jive with the situation? For example, the Chitimacha Choctaw tribe that we saw earlier, right? How do we reconcile these narratives? And the last couple of slides that I want to mention here, shifting gears a little bit, sort of as the last consideration, is the concerns that mitigation imposes on adaptation, okay? And so in the wake of the UN Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, we said that we're going to try to limit our global temperature changes to 2 degrees C, and really we want to target 1.5 degrees C. That 1.5 degrees C target really came from what was termed the High Ambition Coalition, which was a set of governments that came to the UN agreement and really pioneered by small island states, saying that, no, we're going to drown if you let us go to 2 degrees C. We need to be at 1.5. Otherwise, we lose everything, and we're confronted with the idea of not just adaptation, but whole large-scale mobility, right, actually moving. And so again, how does that actually fit into this broader narrative of migration and mobility is interesting to me. But really, this 1.5 came from this High Ambition Coalition. The other interesting things about this agreement is that there were calls to revisit this climate financing issue and try to shunt more funds towards adaptation. There still hasn't really been a convincing stream of adaptation funds to result as of yet. And what was interesting is, for the first time, they mentioned the term losses and damages, which has been a red herring within UN negotiations, because when you say the terms loss and damage, that suggests that there's culpability or liability somewhere. So what's interesting about this is that they actually included a specific clause that says will not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So we'll consider paying out for losses and damages. This is the adaptation as equity discourse, right? But not provide any basis for liability or compensation. How you do one without the other boggles my mind, but that is what is going to trip up climate financing, adaptation financing. And I end here just again to highlight these limits of adaptation. What you're looking at here is what we call our burning embers diagram. And this is actually showing you that even at 1 degree C, there are several ecosystems that humans rely on, in addition to natural ecosystems, that are already facing moderate to very high levels of risk. So warm water corals, even where we are today at 1 degree C, are facing high to very high levels of risk. And similarly, as we can kind of move through different ecosystems. And what that suggests is that there are both soft and hard limits to adaptation. So for coral reefs, even under a 1.5 degree scenario, and just think for a second about the distribution of coral reefs around the world, in the tropics, and the communities that rely on them. Even at 1.5 degrees C, we're facing a loss of corals, very sensitive, of about 70 to 90%, which is huge, after which adaptation actions become infeasible. So what transformative changes will we think about there? And there are a few options on the table, but you can kind of see where the hard adaptation limits is versus the soft adaptation limits, where actions may not be currently available, but we could develop adaptations to help bring people out of poverty, to foster better services for human health, to protect coastal livelihoods. And these two things are up to an extent, right? There could be a limit at which these things, even the adaptation options, become infeasible. And so what policies will we enact then? And this kind of brings back, we have put ourselves in such a corner at this point in time where we have waited so long to act on this, that the gaps between adaptation and mitigation and the money that's required they're rising, they're growing. And the trade-offs start to become amplified too. And if we want to hit the 1.5 degree C target and we wait as long as we're waiting, those trade-offs and the potential for maladaptation, right, poorly designed or implemented adaptation options goes way up. And one way to illustrate that they've done with the IPCC report, and these are just a few, have shown in the brown here trade-offs, so maladaptations, or in achieving an improved energy supply, what we might forsake or wind up sacrificing. And in some cases, that can even be clean water and sanitation. This is also showing the potential for synergies. So achieving these goals, okay, and all of these sustainable development goals, while also synergizing across them, okay? But in order to get this and not this, we have to plan appropriately and think through things in a very rigorous way. But this becomes much harder to achieve. Anything in the green, right, the synergies become much harder to achieve the longer that we wait. And these risks start to go up, right, in the brown. And so what I like about this diagram, it's a little bit hard to read, I know, but what I like about this is that they've gone through each sustainable development goal and really flagged where the trade-offs could happen, depending upon how long we wait and what options we actually use to explore more sustainable energy demand, supply, land, and you could look at actually different elements of this as well. And so I end here with some final thoughts on this issue, and I think we're going to 5:30, so that leaves us hopefully about 20, 25 minutes of Q&A. And like I said, I'm showing some examples. Adaptation, when we talk about mitigation, we can talk about limiting fossil fuels, holding companies and governments accountable, replanting trees, maybe carbon dioxide removal, but these are kind of more global solutions that we talk about. Adaptation, on the other hand, is really hard to nail down as one thing. And so I've just shown you a litany of different ways of thinking and approaching adaptation. It is inherently local, but it requires systematic planning and involvement at multiple levels. Having said that, while national and international support must be given, there is much to be leveraged at the local scale, knowledge and resources. And so local people must be engaged, and they must have agency, right, even over the resources that are given from higher levels. In the face of hard adaptation limits, we have to embrace and design for a new normal. This could mean other modes of livelihood security, activities that people have not had to engage with previously. It also means that people might leave, and people might leave for reasons that are not climate related. In fact, one of the things that we see in the West African case is that the more a community develops and the more influx of funds, livelihoods, payment that they get through work, the more likely they are to leave, because they have a bit more extra resource that they can use to go and better their lives elsewhere, right? And who is it to tell them no, right? Who is it to say no to that when, in fact, basically everybody in New York City, if you were sitting there at that point, is one of those people, myself included, right? So how do we actually embrace and design for this from a policy to a technological perspective? We must also strike a balance between, in the same vein, our goals for development and our goals for equity. We should be careful of using climate adaptation and climate change as a reason to keep people where they are, or to further some kind of status quo. We need to be mindful of that. And climate adaptation must be forward thinking in order to minimize maladaptation and consider really rigorously the role of natural ecosystems. And understand that in doing so, we will be making really difficult decisions and trade-offs. But these are going to be made even more difficult the longer that we wait. And so the time is now to act soon. So at this point, I've spoken for about 45, 50 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. I apologize for that. But I will stop talking now and say thank you very, very much. And I am very happy to move right into your questions as they relate to this. And I might just turn off my slides as I do that so I can actually see your faces. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Sonali, for this amazing presentation. I'm thinking whether we should give the participants the opportunity to send us questions or first, and then I can continue with the questions that Abby has kindly collected beforehand.
Sure.
Or perhaps I should start with the questions that we already have, and if people feel that they want to send us their questions, they're more than welcome to do so. So, so please allow me to find them first.
Sure, yes, no problem.
Perfect, I found them. So the first question that seems to come from the Philippines, what will possibly happen to third world countries like my country, the participants asking, after this pandemic and global warming still continue to rise?
Yeah, I think that's, as climate scientists, so you'll notice that I rarely use the word prediction. We usually say projection, and that's because predicting things suggests this otherworldly body of knowledge that we really don't have. And so, prediction is hard to really understand what will happen. I think, so there's a couple of things we can say to that. One, if the international community does not act both on the pandemic, right, to curb the pandemic and provide resources to communities in order to do that, and if the international community doesn't act on climate change, right? I mean, the Philippines has emissions, but nowhere really near that of the industrialized nations, right, and powers of the world. We can expect the situation to become much more challenging And then that's going to push us into this realm of having to consider the transformative adaptation options. But I think the important thing to highlight is that we tend to, particularly as individuals, right, when we feel so helpless as individuals in this issue, that it's easy to frame things as like, what will happen, or, you know, to not feel in control of this situation. What will happen to a particular country or a particular people? We need to get into the habit of thinking that that is our choice, right? It's not like this just happens to us without any agency. We can choose what will happen to us by acting collectively and by acting together and by instigating that collective action that we need to tamp down. So what will happen to you doesn't have to be inevitable, and it doesn't have to be completely inevitable. It doesn't have to be something that just happens. It can be a fight that you advocate for, that you have voice in, and we can decide that and choose that. So rather than answer your question with an exact what will happen, what I want to try to help provide is the agency and the ability to say what will happen is what you determine to happen, right, as a collective force. And I think if we start thinking about it that way, we stop asking ourselves what will happen to us, but more of this is what I want to happen, so how do I affect that change?
But I guess what is necessary for this is perhaps, and I will go back to one of the first points that you made, this decision making in a micro scale, and the empowerment of local governments, but also communities, because in order for communities to be able to take things on their hands, I mean, it requires resources, both financial, but also a type of decentralization of power. And I think that point was quite interesting in developing a link between the intention within communities and but also as individuals, and how much power we have to implement what we want what we want to happen. So there is a question that I have just received via the chat room, and it's the following. So how would you politically manage the input of international advisors, such as data resources, etc., as overseers of the local, where you say adaptive solutions exist? I think it's very much related to what we've just discussing. Talk about outreach.
Yeah. So outreach. I think, you know, with the outreach thing, Ruth, I think I might need a little bit more clarification about what you want, what you're interested in terms of the outreach intersection. Just to answer that first part, or to speak to the first part, that is a really interesting and difficult question, right? You've got this team of international advisors, right, that's going to go in, particularly if you're treating climate adaptation as a development problem, right, from a development framing. You've got this international, and not just international, likely very much industrialized nation perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Coming into a community, providing resources, and then having expectations from that community, overseeing, right, as the term uses, what that community does, and then kind of having to navigate that. And on the one hand, you can rationalize that by saying, well, if the funds are coming from an international community, don't they deserve to provide oversight? And we can talk about that. I think the one way that, and to be honest, this is almost like a political economy question, right? And as a natural scientist, I'm not fully fit to answer this question, other than to say that from what I've noticed and from working in the Zimbabwe context and in South Asia, right, that was UKAID funded. So that was an international, right, industrialized actor bringing aid money into these regions to look at this problem. They had never done a project like the one that we had done with AgMet, which is a research-driven project, right? Most of their projects were really about, I don't know, going into a community, building some kind of irrigation system, for example, right, providing some years of money of operation and then leaving, and then not really, I'm not accusing UKIID of this necessarily, but we've seen examples of this, right, and then they leave and that money is not sustainable. Unlike that, this was a science project. And so there were actually, in some ways it seems like bureaucracy, but it turned out not to be. There were several levels. The actual development officers were several levels removed from the scientists conducting the work in the field. And those scientists were the ones that we kind of co-developed protocols for them to engage with local stakeholders. And so when you put the scientists almost kind of in this buffer zone between the people who are making decisions and the people who are providing the money, I'm not saying that that broke the, that enabled more agency, but it created this really interesting freedom of discussion on the local scale that I'm not sure that project would have had if the development, if UKID was directly involved and didn't have that scientific capacity, that scientific level between those two. And what that meant is that we were able to advocate, right, as kind of the Western scientists coming into this, we were able to kind of just be like, no, we've got this project, right, and provide that line of communication to kind of break the access, right, to the people who are doing the local work. And that's just an observation. I'm not saying that that's explicitly necessarily how it worked if I were to analyze things, but that's an observation that allowed our project to proceed really well. And that Zimbabwe example, that wasn't just a theoretical example. That 3-step process was actually implemented and actually gave return to farmers. Like, that's actually measurable. And that was something that was entirely implemented at the local scale. So, and that outreach was between the local scientists and the local stakeholders. And that wasn't always pretty. Like, there were arguments that resulted about, even between the local stakeholders, the people who manage the water versus the people who manage the roads, for example, like, would get into fights about things, right? But you need to let those conversations play out, right? You need to let that happen. And so that's what I found to be really interesting and distinctive in this project, as opposed to other projects that I know and have been a part of.
Mm-hmm. So Ruth continues with a question on whether there is a conflict between the local versus the international, which I think you probably covered in your answer. And there is a further question by Ming Lee, who says, I teach a seminar on the historical relations between cities and nature, hidden lands, countryside. So she came later to your presentation, and she's not sure if you have addressed this earlier on, but she's curious to hear your thoughts on how adaptation to climate change affects the relations between urban centers and rural agricultural areas, especially around food production and food security. And how is the increased urbanization of the world related to some of these adaptation frameworks around food and perhaps also other areas?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and both fascinating and fraught at the same time. So yes, the distinction and increasing removal of urban and ag centers, it presents a huge challenge for adaptation in rural communities, right? In some ways, right? In some ways, what we see, particularly in the South Asian context, where I'm doing much of my work, right? You have a lot of remittances, right? Young people who are not in ag anymore, who have moved to cities to find better employment opportunities, and they're not always necessarily better, but maybe they come across funds from assorted jobs more regularly, and they'll send remittances back to rural areas. And so on the one hand, there's an argument that goes, well, it's good to let people leave for urban centers that can actually help bring funds in and buffer rural communities. And we actually see that in some of the West African migration processes as well too. Mobilities as well too. And so there's reason to think about that critically. On the other hand, when we start talking about agricultural adaptation, right, in rural areas, there's often, and they really shouldn't be so distinguished, but there are often two classes of adaptation that we talk about. One is sustainable intensification, or kind of consolidating land, intensifying production, and making that production more efficient. The other kind of camp is providing smallholders more resources, diversifying production, thinking about it in more agroecological terms, right? And there are challenges with both, right? On the one hand, right, industrialization can be easier to manage. It kind of slots into the narrative, right? It can be easier to manage. There's more machinery, less people. You let people go to urban centers, and maybe you produce more on the land. That being said, it's intensive and it's fraught with a whole assortment of both environment and nutritional issues and food security issues, to be honest. If you go the way of agroecology, right, as an adaptation solution for climate change, and that's exactly what my Climate and Rice project will be focusing on in the spring, one of the things that you note that when you diversify your cropping systems, which is definitely a climate adaptation, right? Diversification of cropping systems is a very good way to adapt to climate change, but that requires more labor. Right? These agroecological methods often require much more labor. So how do you incentivize agriculture as a career? How do you provide the rural support systems that farmers and farm laborers need to feel protected and supported as they embark on more complex agroecosystems, right, as a form of climate adaptation? That's something that I don't have an answer to, but it's something that we're actively exploring in the case of smallholder rice systems across South Asia. And so what I hope is to come away with policy solutions, right, working with that AgMIP approach, climate, crop, social scientists, to come away with some policy solutions of saying, okay, if we want to farm rice in a more sustainable way and do it in a more diversified system, and we need more labor in order to do that, how do we do that in a way that protects the labor source, protects the farmer, provides resources and supports. And also there's that gender element too that's really important there. What are some policy options to enable that from the local scale up to the upper level scale? So I just want to acknowledge that that is a really important question, and I don't have a one-size-fits-all solution for that yet. But I think by identifying where the barriers are in each particular context, we can actually start to tackle that with some options. And that might be high-value markets to tap into initially, that eventually lead to more systematic policy changes.
Thank you, Sonali. There is a very interesting question. I'm sorry, I think I know that the plan was to go through the questions that we have.
Up to you. Yeah.
It says I can't ignore the audience.
Of course.
Teresa, who is writing to us from Europe, she has a question around climate mobility, and she says, so there is currently a crucial differentiation between the status of political refugee and economic migrant. And I think you touched on this idea of mobility and freedom of mobility a bit in your talk. So climate change induced mobility would require a climate refugee status to be globally acknowledged and defined and supported. Is this being discussed, accepted, implemented? Where? If so, where?
Yeah, and this is often fraught as well too, because to define a climate refugee, you need to somehow define the reason for leaving, right? You kind of need to really identify the climate change signal. And one of the things, at least for West Africa, that we're finding is that it's not always that clear, and at least it's not what people would tell you, the reason that they're leaving. The one example that I said that I gave in the presentation, where we've actually defined that term and used it and implemented it within the Chitimacha Choctaw tribe off of the Isle de Jean Charles, and I'll just quickly, very quickly, just go back to that slide very quickly. I know there's a lot of text on it. So there was this U.S. example here. With the National Disaster Resilience Competition that actually gave $48 million to relocate the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe which has lost about 98% of their land. Here's their land, the Isles of Jean Charles off in the Gulf Coast. And they were effectively our first climate refugees nationally in the United States, and were awarded funds specifically to relocate as a result of climate change damages on their homelands. And so there are emerging examples of this in different areas around the globe, but it can often be fraught because when you term somebody a climate refugee, and I'm sure, Teresa, you're well aware of this since you're asking the question, but just to kind of back up for a second, that has some implications along the lines of the losses and damages clause in the Paris report, right? It suggests that, well, first of all, you have to acknowledge that climate change drove that. That climate change is real, which most nations in the world have done, except we keep being a little bit reticent about that here. And that somebody bears responsibility for that, right? And so to relocate or move or have that kind of responsibility assigned is politically very fraught. And so the U.S. actually went ahead and kind of did it for this particular tribe, which was kind of unprecedented and set a precedent. Marshall Islands as well too, with a U.S. negotiation agreement, is kind of witnessing the same thing. And of course, they've had mobility between the U.S. for a long time due to weapons testing, but that's being heightened due to climate change. And so distinguishing now between climate refugees in that context is a point of discussion. And then of course there are examples between Australia and island nations surrounding Australia, and then now emergingly in South Asia, right, when you start to look at the situation of Bangladesh. But in those cases, there still has not been like a climate refugee term used or implemented for the sake of actually providing funds for losses and damages. So this is an ongoing point of discussion in very regional context. Globally, there's not really been a lot of mobilization on it yet. And you can see from that discussion I presented, there are actually communities that don't necessarily think that having a broad uniform definition of a climate refugee is exactly the way to go, right? Because people move for all sorts of reasons, and really trying to distinguish that, as outside of conflict or like political asylum, right, or asylum applications, really discerning where that signal is there and where it's compounded by other things is a complicated process. So I think there's still going to be a lot more work to be done internationally before you actually start seeing that, leverage. And there's really a lot of discussion and debate about whether or not that should be done even within the academic community.
So perhaps the question is on whether, not necessarily whether someone needs to have the status of a refugee in order to be able to travel from one place to another, but whether we need to think differently about freedom of mobility generally.
Right, exactly. And I think that's kind of what that Nature article I showed, that's kind of an interesting addition. And actually, I'm happy to share those articles with anyone who wants them. They're actually pretty easy to read. Mariana, I think I've given one to you. They really call for a new way and paradigm of thinking about mobility and thinking about the way that we address movement as a whole, and then the place that climate fits within that. Now, if you're on a small island nation like the Marshall Islands or Seychelles or Maldives or things like that, I think there's room to talk about not necessarily climate refugee status, but losses and damages and, sort of the loss of a homeland as a result of climate change and the implications that has. They'll have to move, right? Like, where would they go, right? If you lose your land like that. But noting that as a refugee and what comes with that versus just mobilizing and rebuilding your livelihood someplace else, that's a really sensitive topic that needs to be, do you look at it as equity, or do you look at it as just a rite of passage, right? Is an important thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that, there is a question around global citizenship, but I think you Perhaps you covered that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I might have covered that. I'm not sure exactly what the context was for that question, in the sense that should we be thinking, I mean, the way I interpreted that question is, should we be thinking about this on a national scale or an internet, or thinking more of ourselves less as identified with the country from which we come, but more on a global. And I think there's utility to doing that. I mean, like, you know, I guess I feel some kind of national pride, although although it's challenging in these times. But you know, I'm myself. I'm American born, but of Indian descent. My entire family is back in India. I married an Australian man. So I mean, it's just like like, you know, my allegiances are to the earth at this point, right? More than anything else. So I think there's utility that comes with that. But the problem, I think, you know, where thinking nationally needs to be important, or needs to be given some sensitivity, are those cultures and peoples whose nations have been compromised as a result of both capitalism and other resource extraction. You know, that I have the privilege of being able to think globally, or feel like a global citizen. And I really feel like that's a privilege. And I don't know that everybody has that privilege, or are engendered or included in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I continue to the next question, I want to check with Abby. I know that the event was meant to finish at 5:30, so I'm wondering, have we got time for one more question? What?
Yeah, I think so. Let's go ahead.
Okay.
If you need to leave, if 5:30 is a hard stop, of course, you're welcome to, but we'll continue with another question.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going.
Okay, I would suggest that, I mean, I'll ask again whether there are any more questions from the participants. Otherwise, I'm going. It's difficult to choose because there are so many interesting questions here. Some are related to the coronavirus outbreak. I'm not sure. I mean, Sonali, do you think that there is something specifically that you would like to address?
Oh gosh, there's so much here.
Exactly. This is that's exactly what I mean.
I mean, yeah, I could even just systematically go down. And so, thank you, Sejo.
I'm wondering,
yeah.
can I ask you something that I wanted to ask you while I was listening to your talk. The one, I mean, it's not a long question, but I was wondering about this relationship between this idea of uncertainty and decision making, and I think that it made me think about the tools that we have to predict, technological tools, and whether as a scientist you feel that we need other ways, not necessarily of predicting, as you said before, but as a way to project, but also as a way to imagine.
Right.
And the second one had to do with the decision making, but I think we touched on this, on the relationship of the decision making and how much empowered are the communities, how much power have the communities in this decision making, I guess.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, and it's a great question, right? And so the tools, you know, the tools and at least for the climate side of things, the climate models that, you know, we're pushing those models and those tools to make, you know, fine scale predictions, you know, in ways that that are really different from what they were originally intended to do, which was to look at just big macro scale, you know, indicators of the climate, to basically understand the climate system, not necessarily project its change. And so, you know, in terms of needing other tools or other means, you know, I think in addition to, so yes, there's definitely a need to get an idea of how climate's going to change. And so instead of a particular prediction, we do that by assessing uncertainty, right? We say, okay, here's what's going to happen under the best case scenario based upon a whole bunch of estimates. Here's what's going to happen under the worst case scenario based upon a couple of estimates. And see how that, you know, and we're going to hand that to a decision maker, and they're going to see how they feel about that, right? Where it sits on their scale of adaptation. Now you'll notice for the crop, the crop results we showed for Zimbabwe, those range from like a 20% decrease to a 20% increase. So if you're a decision maker and you're sitting there and you're looking at that, you're like, well, I'm just going to do nothing because I could have a decrease or an increase. Like that's not very helpful. And so we need to get better we do have to make these tools better. And this was the first time that project actually did that kind of a project like this. That was our project was the first one to do that kind of comparison. So we didn't know that the models were so different from each other. So, so that's something that we can improve. We've identified that now. The stakeholders know about it now. So we're improving that method actively. So that's definitely something that can happen. The other thing that needs to happen is that, you know, if you're sitting there farming a crop with diminishing resources, I'm just putting this in the ag context, and you're farming it in a way that's really degrading to the environment, right? Degrading to the soils, degrading to the resource base, and then you're asking a scientist how climate change might impact you, there are probably, you probably want to not just be asking the climate scientists, but you probably also want to be looking at how are your own actions making that system vulnerable, right? How do you address vulnerabilities within the system? And it may not even be your own actions. It might be something much more systematic, and it often is. But I think alongside to developing these tools to aid in projection, we need to also be working on identifying ways of identifying vulnerabilities in our system that just should not be there to begin with, right? We shouldn't be looking to put a climate adaptation policy as a Band-Aid on a broken system, right? Or as a Band-Aid on a system that's not working for us. So I think what we should be doing, in addition to improving our predictive models, is really starting to analyze these systems for what's working, what's not working, and looking to do away with vulnerabilities. And a great example of that is COVID, right? Why is it that there are farmers right now who are producing a lot that are having to plow their crops under and letting them rot in the fields because they can't get them, to their points of retail anymore? Clearly, our supply chain system is broken. We've made it super productive, right? We have focused for so long in our supply chains on efficiency, getting, this commodity from point A to point B with minimal resources in the quickest amount of time. And we've been very good at that, very, very good, at least in the industrialized world, at making that happen, right? However, in doing that, we have sacrificed resilience. We have sacrificed, right, the redundancy that nature develops all over the place, right, in order to move things around. Our pantries, our food pantries, right, and soup kitchens often don't have the refrigeration capacity, right, to deal with that. Why is that the case? So these are things that this crisis has elucidated for us to say, okay, that is a vulnerability, and forget about climate change. We should just be fixing this to begin with. And that, alongside improved predictive models, can help us to shrink that gap on the actions that, on adapting to a particular climate and the actions that we should be taking, right? It reduces that vulnerability. So I think that's really, I think this crisis has really elucidated for us where those gaps lie. And it's something that would really help us to actively work alongside improving our predictions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's time for us to thank everyone for attending the event today. Thank you so much, Sonali, for the amazing presentation, and Abby and Apexar. Let me just check the. Oh yeah, it's thank you messages from everyone. You can see.
Thank you, everybody.